But how should he attack? Schnaufer dived until the outlines of the bomber could be seen only vaguely against the sky. Now he must make the decisive attack from below. He pulled the nose of the machine up and zoomed like an arrow at the bomber, but the latter had been watching and met him once more with a confetti rain of tracers. The iron nerves and the cool judgment of this wing commander came to his aid. He flew for 2 seconds into the defence fire before he fired his cannon. The master of ceremonies exploded in the air, a giant Catherine wheel. Burning fragments fell on Schnaufer's machine, setting the starboard engine on fire. He was surrounded by a bright firework display of flash bombs, green, red and yellow rockets, and bright parachute flares swaying slowly earthwards. His engine was still on fire. To prevent the worst, he had to close the firecock and stop the engine. Fortunately, no British night fighter was in the vicinity, or he would have been doomed. The parachute flares drifted slowly to the ground, where the wreckage of the Master of Ceremonies aircraft was still blazing. The site of the kill was just southwest of Stuttgart. Schnaufer now found himself in the middle of the bomber stream, which was making for the false marker flares. About 400 British bombers dropped their load in open country. A smile appeared on Schnaufer's face. In this welter of bombers, a gigantic black shadow suddenly shot above the cockpit of the damaged night fighter. The gunner, who was on the alert, caught the enemy machine in his sights and blazed away with the machine guns until the barrels were hot. He was successful. The petrol tanks caught fire, and the bomber dived earthwards in flames. "Nice work, Wilhelm," said Schnaufer on the RT, as he congratulated his stout gunner. "But now we'll take a powder before the night fighters spot us. We can't afford any larks with only one engine." The wing commander put his machine into a steep dive, and an hour later the victorious crew landed at St. Trond. Obituary. Later, as a good Swabian, Schnaufer, on a cold February night in 1945, continued his efforts. Taking off from Gütersloh, the major, who in the meantime had been promoted Group Commodore and awarded the diamonds to his Knight's Cross, shot down 7 4-engined bombers within 90 minutes, a unique achievement in the history of German night fighters. In further bitter combats, he and his crew raised their total victories to 126. At the end of the war, the British transported Schnaufer's crack machine to England. The Londoners were able to admire the Mima 110 in Hyde Park. Shaking their heads, they counted the bars representing kills on the tail unit. 124. 126. They would have liked to bring the spook of St. Trond to London, but Schnaufer lay in the hospital and had no wish to be stared at by the Londoners in Hyde Park. After the war, he came to a tragic end. To the delight of his mother, he took over the family wholesale wine business in his hometown, Carlow, with the same energy as he had shown during the war. This war pilot, who had survived 1,000 dangers, lost his life on a business trip through France. He was driving his car along a perfectly straight road through a forest when a truck turned out of a side road. Schnaufer used his brakes, skidded, and the 2 vehicles collided. Without regaining consciousness, the ace of the German night fighters in the Second World War died of his injuries far from home. Important personalities in the German night fighter arm. General Josef Kammhuber set up the 1st Night Fighter Division in 1940 and introduced new night fighter tactics. In 1943 he commanded 9. Fliegerkorps and became Inspector of Night Fighters. A disagreement with Luftwaffe High Command regarding the correct night fighting measures led to his transfer to Air Fleet 5 in Norway. He was awarded the Knight's Cross on 9th July 1940 with the rank of General Major. I had no luck at St. Trond, 2 ops and no kills, but I was soon sent back to Hungary. It had been quiet there during my absence. No particular incidents except the surprising news that our CO, Poldi Fellerer, had married a pretty Hungarian. We celebrated until late into the night and kept drinking to the health of the young couple. That evening, Poldi took me to one side and told me that I was to be given my own command, a squadron that had been increased in strength. The divisional order would be coming through at any moment. It arrived next day. My new squadron was transferred to Novi Sad near Belgrade. My task? To interfere with the British airlift from Italy to Warsaw. At the age of 22, I had to take full responsibility for all my orders and enforce the regulations. The ground staff went on ahead with the trucks. A commando prepared our quarters and took care of the technical installations. I took off in formation with 12 night fighters for my new airfield on 28th of July 1944. We flew low over the Blue Lake Balaton and veered off eastwards to the Danube. After crossing the river, we turned on a southerly course, and now, below us, lay the endless Puszta. Occasionally we roared over a village, and the peasants looked up in terror as though a storm had suddenly broke. Although the Puszta is a desert, it has its own particular charm. A few small lakes and moors, and then endless brown steppe. An occasional, almost biblical well-heralded another village. The sun beat down pitilessly on the flat country, parching the earth. It was even hot in our cockpits. Towards the south, green fields and extensive cultivation appeared. We flew over the Batschka, a German minority region. Here the villages were larger and more beautiful, and the fields better cultivated. Dipping our wings, we greeted our landsmen. They waved bright cloths to us and threw their hats in the air. After 70 minutes' flight, a small chain of hills appeared on the horizon, the Fruška Gora. Here the Danube bends eastwards towards Romania. Novi Sad lies just south of the mountain chain. I made a wide sweep and broke formation. We landed at short intervals and parked our machines in front of the small hangars. My adjutant, Oberleutnant Schuleit, who had been in charge of the commando, came up with a smile and gave me his report. Everything was in order. Our quarters were ready, and a shed had been cleared for use as a workshop. Mess, headquarters, recreation rooms and huts. Schuleit had organised this in the shortest possible time and satisfied all our demands. The Hungarians were very polite and took a lot of trouble to gratify our wishes. Schuleit was a splendid negotiator. The conversations were in broken German and a terrible mixture of other languages. But even when the Hungarian liaison officer came to the end of his knowledge of German and began to gesticulate in his mother tongue, Schuleit kept saying benignly, "Igen, Igen," as though he had understood. Schuleit was known as Igen. He had done a good job, and late that evening I could report to the divisional commander that we were ready for ops. The July nights in Hungary are very hot. We lay in deck chairs outside headquarters at the edge of the airfield, waiting for divisional orders. I assembled the crews and told them of our duties. I took the precaution of detailing 2 waves to fight the British supply machines. The first wave was to attack them on the flight to Warsaw, and the second on the return trip to Foggia. As emergency landing strips, we had Budapest, Belgrade and Sombor at our disposal. We had to fly over partisan country. In view of this, each crew took a Tommy gun and provisions for 3 days. Furthermore, on a forced landing in partisan zones, all uniforms had to be destroyed. Otherwise there was no chance of the men ever getting back to their own lines alive. The crews made their preparations. My fighter controlling officer, Oberfeldwebel Kramer, reported that the runway was ready for landing and, to give stress to his words, proudly turned on the obstacle, boundary and flare path lights. Everything was improvised, and it seemed as though a magician had been at work. I ordered everyone to headquarters so that we could inspect the airfield with its night illuminations. Kramer gave the necessary orders for starting and landing. There was only one runway, north to south. The east-west axis was not long enough, and to take off towards the south was dangerous, for it was in the direction of the small mountain chain. To the north, the terrain was perfectly flat. It struck me that the artificial takeoff horizon in the west was lacking, and I pointed this out to Kramer. "Hell, Herr Hauptmann, I forgot it. But where can I conjure one up from? We've no cables, no lamps, and no poles." However, Kramer, who in the old days had flown with the Lufthansa, knew how to organize things. In cooperation with Oberleutnant Igen, He laid on 20 wooden poles and petrol lamps. The men went out into the fields with spades and axes, planted the poles 30 feet apart, and slung the lamps on them. We now had a take-off horizon, even though these petrol lamps were rather difficult to see. But it was better than nothing. For the young crews, this artificial horizon was an important accessory on take-off. That evening we were admiring the glorious starry sky, as we had so often done before, when the telephone rang and 3 machines were ordered to their night fighting sectors. Presumably an English formation was on the way. Well, that was fine. I grabbed my revolver and hurried to the machine. Marley and Grasshoff were already aboard, fastening their parachutes. With the cockpit roof open, I taxied to the start, closed the roof, and was the first to take off for Sector Scorpion. The communication with my controller was okay, but shortly after takeoff, we received the order: return to base. The enemy formation had presumably turned for home. I preferred to think that it was a practice takeoff laid on by the division. So I said farewell to my controlling officer Schwartz, who was sitting somewhere in an abandoned nest in the Puster. He had built up the ground radar station Scorpion with a few soldiers from the signals service. I set my course for Novi Sad and began to lose height. From a long way off, I could recognize Kramer's ground lights and beacons. Making a wide sweep, I landed a bare 20 minutes after takeoff. The mechanics refueled my machine, and I had a chat with Kramer about improving the airfield lighting. The crews stood around watching their fellow pilots land. Oberleutnant Buder, who was fresh to a night-fighting squadron, came in, followed by Feldwebel Hubach. Both of them grinned as they reported back from ops and were duly chuffed by their companions. 30 minutes after landing, Division gave orders for 3 further machines to take off. The situation was as follows: English bomber formation over the Adriatic, flying a northeasterly course. This time it seemed to be the real thing. I took off once more with Buder and Hubach, and yet within half an hour we were recalled. "Rise, rise, no aircraft in the air," came over the air. "Service, Earthworm, sleep well," I said to my fighter controller, and landed shortly after midnight on my airfield. As I entered the mess, I met a group of cheerful Hungarian officers. "Joe Estetriwano," I heard. "Come and drink with us to International Flying Good Fellowship." We celebrated until the following morning. Only as the sun rose did I lie down with a thick head on my bed. The following days were spent settling down in Novi Sad. Gradually, we grew accustomed to the peculiarities of the partisans. At first, we noticed the disappearance of the petrol lamps and that the artificial horizon grew ever smaller. Kramer cursed to himself, took a Tommy gun, and rushed with a few soldiers across the maize fields. In the distance, we could hear the sounds of firing. After half an hour, the horizon was repaired, and Kramer returned. "Why did you shoot, Kramer?" I asked him. "Herr Hauptmann, the fellows hide in the maize fields like moles. Do you think I'm going to let myself be shot down by a pack of bloody gypsies? I put the breeze up them, but the next time we'll take some hand grenades. That will make them sit up." I merely replied, "Again." That night, I took the new crews out on a practice flight. We had been flying barely an hour when the landing machines were fired on from the Fruska Gora. From my headquarters, I heard the clatter of a machine gun and took a bearing. I broke off the practice flight and ordered the machines to be examined. The mechanics found several bullets in the wings and fuselage, and in one case the main wireless cable was cut. I reflected for a moment on what was the best thing to do and took off in another machine to counterattack. We dived on the enemy positions with all our guns blazing. Silence reigned. There was no firing as we landed. Next evening, however, we were woken by a tremendous explosion. We grabbed our Tommy guns. What was up? Had one of the machines exploded? Fortunately, no. As a precautionary measure, I had placed a guard with a password on each of them. A soldier reported shortly afterward that a bridge had been blown up not far from the airfield. These guerrilla tactics continued every day. A flak company, felling trees for building their gun positions, was ambushed in a sunken road near the Fruska Gora and murdered. One man got away and reported the fate of his comrades later the same night. Thus, there was always some activity, if not in the air, on the ground. It was strange. By day, the sun seemed to shine on harmless peasants, busy at their fields and who bowed as we passed. A peaceful sight. But by night, hell was let loose and the partisans were in their element. Exactly 14 days after my arrival at Novi Sad, we had our first contact with the enemy. Shortly before midnight on 10th August 1944, Division reported the approach of a single enemy aircraft from the east, a Russian then. I took off with my crew for Sector Scorpion and called the ground station. Lieutenant Schwartz reported and said, "Wait." The Russian was still about 40 miles away, and it would be 10 minutes before he could be picked up by our radar. Obviously, it would be an aircraft of the type Mitchell B-25, a rapid, handy machine. The minutes passed. Schwartz led me on an easterly course towards the enemy. The distance soon decreased. Suddenly he ordered, "Left-hand turn to course 260. I pulled my machine round and gave full throttle. My enemy was flying 2,000 yards ahead of me. We should have difficulty in catching him, for the Russian was flying at 260 mph and losing height. Slightly irritated, I gave Lieutenant Schwartz a rocket for not having put me on the course earlier. The Russian was already disappearing out of my SN2. I flew for another few minutes on the same course, making wide circles. Then something happened below. An airfield lit up. It was obviously in the notorious partisan area, for its lights showed a gigantic red Soviet star. A few white lights served to help the pilot land. I throttled down my engine so as not to make myself conspicuous, for now I must wait until the machine took off again. Half an hour passed. The supply plane, which had brought weapons and munitions, would take back a load of pork and wheat. After an hour, the ground station reported that the Mitchell was on the return flight. The machine gained height and was flying at a speed of only 200 mph. I dived like a hawk from my superior altitude and soon caught him. The Russian had suspected nothing, for he did not imagine there would be any German night fighters in that god-forsaken region. I got on his tail and scrutinized the outlines of the Mitchell, which showed up clearly against the clear sky. I cast a swift glance at my firing control lights. All 6 of them flashed red. The attack began with a long burst in the left wing, which seemed to have little effect. The wing caught fire, but the flames went out after a few seconds. It was now flying slower, and I had difficulty in throttling back. His port engine failed. I stalked him cautiously, for the crew had now been warned and would sell their lives dearly. For this reason, I decided upon a seesaw attack, which would give the Russians a difficult target. From a slight superiority in height, I dived on the machine and slipped away through the slipstream of the Mitchell to port. At that moment, I opened the second attack and fired a burst at the enemy's cockpit. The Russian crew replied with a murderous defensive fire, framing me with tracers. Tuck, tuck, tuck. The bullets hit my aircraft. I looked back at my crew to see that everything was in order. Grasshoff replied, "Everything okay, Herr Hauptmann." My second attack was also successful, but the machine did not go down, although the left wing was on fire. The Russian gunner was now awaiting me from port. I dived rapidly below him onto his starboard side and attacked again. He had not been expecting this. A few seconds were enough to give him the coup de grâce. Bright red flames lit up the dark night. But the machine continued on its easterly course. The rear gunner kept firing long bursts with his 4 machine guns. But his aim was inaccurate and the tracers did not find their mark. I could wait, and so flew away from the burning machine. The crew still had time to save their lives by bailing out. At each moment, the fire took a greater hold. Pieces flew off from the wings, and then the petrol tank exploded, lighting up the red star on the fuselage. With a gigantic tail of fire streaming from its right wing, it dived vertically towards the ground. Involuntarily, I dived after him to follow the crash. At that moment, the cool-headed rear gunner must have spotted me. From the doomed aircraft suddenly came a burst of fire which hissed past my wing. I had not expected this. Here was real self-sacrifice. In such a hopeless position, the crew should have bailed out if they set any value on their lives, but instead of this, they defended themselves desperately to the bitter end. A few seconds later, the machine crashed with all its crew. I respected these opponents. "Crazy fellows," said Mahler, sighing deeply, "and obstinate as mules. We gave them plenty of time to save their skins." Grasshoff called the ground station. Schwartz replied and congratulated us on our first kill in Sector Scorpion. Then he said good night. After 2.5 hours, I roared over the illuminated airfield of Novi Sad and dipped my wings. This first success was the beginning of a long series achieved by my squadron. At midday on the following day, the telephone rang. Lieutenant Schwartz reported, "Congratulations, Herr Hauptmann. It was a fine show. Perhaps we'll spot another one tonight. You must come hunting in my sector more often." "Okay," I replied. "Call me in good time so that we can come to grips with the pirates." But things remained quiet until 15th August. That night something very curious happened. At about 21:30 hours, Lieutenant Schwartz reported a single machine flying in from the east, another partisan supply aircraft. I took off a quarter of an hour later and reported about 22 hours over Sector Scorpion. Schwartz and my radio operator got into communication, and the fighter controller immediately gave his first order. "Wait a little. The enemy is flying in." Some minutes passed before the second report came. "Enemy now flying in our sector at 9,000 feet, 40 miles away. Go up to 11,000 feet. I gained height and loaded my guns. My gunner Mahler reported, "Herr Hauptmann, today the first burst must be a winner. Those fellows get very irritable if we only tickle them up a bit." "If your guns are sighted properly, my dear Mahler, everything will be all right," I replied icily. Mahler was right. The first attack must succeed, or it would be another circus. "My guns are set at 80 yards, Mahler replied, defending his reputation. "At that distance, the trajectories of the 4 guns meet on the sights." "Then there'll be no cause for complaint," I replied. After this gratifying retort on the orders from the ground station, I set the machine on an easterly course towards the Russian. Distance 8 miles. Enemy approaching fast. Hardly had Schwartz given this order than I saw a bright light between the horizon and the earth. That cannot be a star, I thought. I observed as much to my crew. They all looked ahead and stared spellbound at this white spot which grew larger at every moment. It was, in actual fact, the enemy machine. "Achtung, Achtung, Scorpion from White Thrush. Enemy sighted. Enemy flying with navigating lights." "Victor, Victor," replied Scorpion. "Enemy flying directly towards our position, 5 miles away." "Victor, Victor," I replied. "Park, park." I banked sharply and got on the tail of the enemy machine. This Russian was really irresponsible. Losing height, I soon caught him and flew alongside. It was unbelievable. The fellow was flying with his cockpit fully lit as though it were peacetime. What must the crew be thinking of? I figured it out in this way. In this peaceful sector, the Russian would never suspect the presence of a German night fighter. And why should he have done? A few ridiculous partisan supply aircraft were not worth a night fighter squadron, and the Hungarian flak, they had no respect for that. They were right, for their pathetic batteries would never prove a danger. The machine flew on undisturbed, and I could see the pilot at his controls. Without a care in the world, I accompanied my colleague from the other side and wondered what I should do now. It went against the grain to shoot that sitting target out of the sky. In the meanwhile, the ground station called, "Achtung, Achtung, you're over our position. We can see him, we can see him. Good hunting." I should have preferred to let the enemy go. His lighted cockpit disturbed me so much. but my crew pestered me. "Shoot him down. If we let him through, the partisans will get more Tommy guns, and our soldiers will pay the price." Yes, they were right. He must be brought down, but he must be allowed to defend himself. I looked once more at the pilot's seat and dived away. Then I took aim at the left wingtip from exactly 80 yards. A short burst from 2 cannon rang out. They registered a hit. A small fire flickered and went out immediately. They must have been warned, but nothing happened. The enemy pilot banked slightly but did not switch off his lights. I flew close to him and observed that the crew was having an excited discussion. Obviously they were wondering where the shots had come from. I fired another short burst, this time at his right wingtip. The same thing occurred. A small fire, which went out immediately. Now by rights the crew should have bailed out, for we could not go on much longer with this game. But after a few uncontrolled movements, the machine proceeded on its course. The lights were still on. Now I had to take things seriously, or we should have reached partisan country, and there was no point in letting the Russians bail out merely to increase their numbers. After these 2 warning shots in the wings, I could not hesitate any longer. "Shoot them in the petrol tanks. The gentleman will be more comfortable bailing out," Grashoff shouted angrily over the RT. But I was sorry for the crew, and I fired so that, if the machine crashed, the crew would be able to be saved. I flew close to my enemy. Hungry flames were already licking the starboard tank and lighting up my own machine. At last a man bailed out. I began to count. 1, 2, but the 2 stuck in my throat, for no one followed him. The machine stayed in the air for another few seconds, and then went into a vertical dive. The mystery was cleared up the next day. I learnt from Schwartz that the pilot who had bailed out, a Russian colonel, had been taken with a broken leg to Chambord Hospital. I drove over to see him. The doctor gave me the first report. The Russian colonel had been given orders to fly a group of young cadets over the partisan route. To their surprise, they had been hit by flak. When the machine caught fire, the colonel was the only one who was able to bail out. I asked the doctor if I could speak to the colonel, and he gave me permission. I had a strange feeling as I opened the door of the ward. The Russian lay in bed staring into space and hardly vouchsafed me a look. I went over to him, laid a packet of cigars on his night table and shook his hand. He suddenly turned round, smiled and thanked me in broken German for my attention. His face seemed to say, "What is the reason for this friendly visit from a German officer?" Before I explained, I heard his account of the previous night's incident through an interpreter. The crew really had thought that they had been hit by Hungarian flak and had therefore not taken things seriously until the decisive moment came, which the colonel related as follows. I was rather excited by the hits on my wingtips and looked at the terrified faces of my cadets. The youngsters had no parachutes. So far we had carried out our flights without enemy attack, and parachutes are rare in Russia. I had difficulty in calming them, but they had a presentiment of the disaster and stared out into the darkness at the earth which lay thousands of feet below. I shall never forget the questioning look of the youngest, a fair-haired boy of hardly 18 who sat next to me in the cockpit. When another explosion made the machine shudder and the bright flames from the right wing dazzled us, he grabbed my thigh and stared at me in terror. But once more we were lucky. The fire went out and both engines were still running smoothly. I thought that the worst was over and wanted to light a cigar to encourage the youngsters. No more signs of the flak. My young neighbour breathed with relief and lit my cigar. At that moment there was a terrible crash. One of the boys shouted, "Fire! The starboard petrol tanks are alight." What happened next was really a matter of seconds. Panic broke out on board. Some of them clawed the floor. I was almost crazy watching this tragedy and could hardly bear to abandon the machine. Then the flames licked the cabin and the acrid smoke enveloped us. The air was searing hot and the light went out. We flew on like this for a while, until the starboard engine fell out of the burning wing. The machine immediately dived earthwards. With my last remaining strength, I managed to get out of the burning hulk and only came to my senses when I landed heavily on the ground with my parachute. The colonel at these words looked at the plaster on his right leg and went on. Yes, with parachutes we should all have been alive, for we had plenty of time. Yes, you had time, I replied. But do you know why? The colonel shook his head. With the aid of their interpreter, I let him know that it was I who had shot him down, and not the Hungarian flak. I had given him and his crew plenty of opportunity to bail out by merely firing at his wingtips. The colonel understood. Tears ran down his cheeks. Now he could explain the riddle of the flak shots. He looked at me sadly and seemed to say, "You meant well, comrade." Suddenly he took my hand and pressed it. I was embarrassed and left the sick room without a word. In the town, I bought a bunch of flowers and gave a small Hungarian girl a pengo to deliver them to the Russian colonel in hospital. On 21st August 1944, 6 days after my meeting with the Russian colonel, I shot down my third Mitchell with its Russian crew after a bitter air combat. The Russian defended himself desperately, but my superior firing power finally turned the scales. After this, the partisans gave up their flights, but on the following night the British resumed their airlift to Warsaw. 22 August 1944, 24 hours. Division reported British bombers flying over the Adriatic on a northeasterly course. My crews were delighted. At last there would be an opportunity for some action. My kills had fired the ambitions of the younger pilots, and I had to calm them down as they hovered around, already in full flying kit. "Take it easy, boys," I said, "and keep your wits about you. Half the battle is to surprise the enemy." But it was difficult to keep them under control. They followed the path of the bomber stream, and when they were reported on the way to Belgrade, there were howls of delight. At last we received orders to take off. I took 6 machines, while 6 remained in reserve to attack the returning bombers. They flew directly over our air sector. Over the RT, I gave my crews their last orders and advice. My sector was the most southerly, and therefore the leading bombers would enter it first. The ground station and wireless operator Grasshoff used their radar, and the first enemy zigzags appeared in the cathode tubes. I should have to dive soon to bring the others onto the course. A few minutes after this radar contact, the bulky shadow of a bomber loomed out of the darkness, a Halifax. The first attack was successful. Flames darted from the petrol tank, and the crew immediately bailed out. For a while, the burning hulk continued to remain aloft, then it nosedived and exploded on the ground. Once more it was a tragic, yet beautiful sight. This was the signal for the general attack. My crews dived like hawks on the bombers, bringing them down one after the other. I counted up to 6, and then there was a pause. I shot down number 7 myself, and then followed numbers 8 and 9. After 3 hours, the operation was over. I was the first to land and counted the homecoming machines. The pilots behaved like maniacs, streaking across the field and dipping their wings. One after another, they proudly reported their kills. Division was already on the line asking for my report. It was short and terse. 6 machines engaged, duration of ops 3 hours, 9 enemy bombers shot down without loss. 2 machines slightly damaged, the remaining 10 ready for further ops. The division was delighted. Oberst Handrick congratulated me personally on our success. "Well, carry on the good job, boys. They'll be on their way back in 4 hours. Take a breather, and we'll notify you in plenty of time. Good luck." But no one thought of taking a rest. They gossiped about their combats late into the night. The telephone rang again. The British were on the way back. Now the second wave had a chance of going into action. We received our starting orders at 03:02 hours. Oberleutnant Egan was in the party. I looked at the machines as they took off and crossed my fingers. From headquarters, we listened intently for the ground-to-air communications. After a long wait, Feldwebel Hubach reported the first contact with the enemy. There were a few anxious moments until he reported again. Sieg Heil. Courier on fire. That was the 10th that night. There were 4 more to come. I estimated that about 30 British bombers had flown in, and 14 of them had bitten the dust. It was a great success for my squadron, particularly as all 6 crews of the second wave returned safe and sound. During the next few nights we had no peace, for the airlift went on from Italy to Warsaw. The British disregarded their huge losses. Night after night these flying goods trains took to the air, and night after night we shot them out of the sky. But one of my crew crashed after a tough combat. On the morning of 6th September 1944, I was rudely awakened from my sleep. The NCO on duty stood at my bedside. I rubbed my eyes and stared at him morosely, but he gave me no time to collect my thoughts. "Get up, Herr Hauptmann, get up quickly. An American bomber formation reported flying directly for Novi Sad." I was up in a flash, put on my shirt and trousers, and rushed down the steps carrying my tunic. As I ran, the officer of the day, Oberleutnant Buder, met me. "It was high time, Herr Hauptmann. We must get off the field. The bombers are already on the horizon, approaching rapidly." I gave my orders swiftly. "Oberleutnant Buder, you take care of the machines. Let the ground staff disperse them, put on the camouflage tarpaulins, and leave the field at once. The NCO on duty is to wake all the crews. Within 5 minutes the airfield must be cleared, whether they're in their pants or their pyjamas." "Very good, sir, within 5 minutes." I rushed to headquarters and called up the division. There was a short delay before I received orders to look for an emergency strip in case our field was put out of action. I replaced the receiver and hurried outside. Marley and the driver were already in the car with the engine running. My gunner was looking anxiously towards the south. Now I could hear the monotonous drone of the American formation. It had a sinister ring. The sun shone down pitilessly, lighting up the silver birds like bright fish. "Get going for the dispersal pens!" I cried. The driver put his foot down and sped to the edge of the runway where the mechanics were putting the last grey-green netting over the snow-white machines before jumping into the waiting truck. It was high time. In a flash, the airfield was cleared. Not a soul to be seen on this doomed eyrie. The first marker bombs soon fell. My car stopped and we flung ourselves flat in the nearest ditch. A sinister hiss filled the air. The earth trembled, and after a deafening explosion, a huge cloud of smoke rose from our sheds. 3 waves flew in, and after 10 minutes our airfield looked like a lunar landscape. The bombers left without any damage to themselves. That same day I drove off to look for a suitable airfield. It was a long time before I found the right spot. Near Hodschak in the Batschka, I found a 700-yard-long meadow broken only by a single ditch. The surrounding country was completely flat, an advantage in the case of a short runway. The burgomaster of this German-Hungarian village did everything in his power to adapt this primitive airfield to our demands. Our over-eager Oberfeldwebel Kramer had naturally illuminated various obstacles, among others a telephone pole that stood at the edge of the field next to the railway line. I was squatting with my crew in a tent lit by a petrol lamp and had given the take-off and landing orders, when outside I heard a loud, long whistle. We looked out and saw a train held by the red signals. Kramer tore his hair and rushed out to tell the engine driver the reasons for our red lamp. On the following day, in the presence of the whole village, we buried our fallen comrades. A mountain of flowers and wreaths adorned the graves of these young men who had met their deaths in so tragic a manner. Mothers and wives whose own sons and husbands were at war wept for the dead as if they had been their own. I made a short speech, for I had known them too well to express in words what their loss meant to me. While the coffins were being lowered into the grave, I wondered whether I could have avoided this misfortune. Perhaps it would have been better to have dispatched the machines in the late evening. But in war, can one ever foresee all the moments of danger? Danger crops up and no one knows when it will be his turn. Deep in thought, I left the cemetery and made a balance sheet of my experiences as a night fighter. It began in 1941. In the very first month, my pals von Campe, Redlich and Geiger were killed, and the chain was never broken. I had to be thankful that I was still alive. This self-preservation urge held good whichever side one was on. We were in a mess, and my men quite rightly demanded of me firm behaviour and belief in victory. I felt that the mood of my squadron, particularly at this moment of continuous setbacks, was dependent upon my behaviour. It lay in my hands whether I allowed the unit under my command to become a hopeless rabble, or instilled it with enthusiasm for self-sacrifice by my own example. The great confidence the airmen themselves showed in me inspired me to overcome all difficulties. Inwardly I was convinced that the war was lost, but it was my duty to continue on this path to the bitter end with my men. This was no blind obedience, but a question of integrity. To conquer with integrity is simple, but to lose with integrity needs great self-control. A few days after our arrival in Hodzhak, Division reported several formations flying from the south. We squatted in our tents and debated the position. Now we could clearly hear the rumble of the front-line guns. The Russians were advancing steadily towards the Danube. 2 machines were ordered to take off. It was understandable that I should be one of them. I ordered Oberleutnant Buda to take off in the second. At 22:31 hours, we left our emergency field. As I yanked the machine off the ground, I found that I had only just had enough room. Landing would be even more difficult. While I was still climbing, the controlling officer sent me after an enemy machine that was flying through our sector at 6,000 feet on a northerly course. At 22:39, I sighted my opponent and attacked immediately. A minute later, the Halifax crashed on fire not far from the airfield. This was the only kill that night. In these breakneck conditions, I was lucky enough to put my machine down after a bare 17 minutes flying time. On the following days, my decimated machines were replaced from Wiener Neustadt. The crews gradually grew accustomed to the small field and enjoyed the extraordinary hospitality of the German minority. After years of war rations, the Hungarian food had the effect of yeast. I could feel it in my own belly. The female element in the village was extremely generous in all respects, and I was soon afraid that my men would be thoroughly spoilt. Even my quartermaster sergeant put on weight. He was thinking of the coming lean years and filled every possible pot with dripping and goose fat. Within a few days, a great friendship had sprung up between the population and the soldiers. The villagers counted our machines on takeoff and waited up to count them on their return. I had to report each night to my billet, otherwise my good hosts could not sleep. Each morning at about 4 o'clock I slipped into their bedroom and wished them "Jo estet rivano." "Edes anja," came the smiling reply. "Now you're all right." From Hodzhak we checkmated the Britishers. Night after night we shot down their bombers and brought their Warsaw airlift to a standstill. On 22nd September 1944, these flights ceased. A few peaceful weeks followed, until the Russians were 30 miles from the village. When it became known that we were to retire to Okeni on the other side of the Danube, there was almost panic in the village. The people could not and would not grasp that they had to leave their homes or stay and face a gruesome fate. At the last moment, they grabbed together a few essentials, inspanned their carts, wrapped their children up in blankets, and set out on the great trek. Everything that they had built up with such industry now had to be left behind. Nearly every family possessed its own big farm with rich fields and cattle. They had grown to be at one with their property, as only peasants who have done all the work with their own hands can be. Despite their distance from Germany, these men remained true to their country. They insisted upon preserving their mother tongue. In the school, German was learnt as the basic language, and they seldom mingled with the Hungarian population. But now the end was near, an end that entailed little but misery, suffering, self-sacrifice, and pain. The women, most of whose men were in the field, had to leave their homes and farms, which had taken a great place in their hearts and on which they had lived happily for so long. The approaching Russian steamroller forced these men to leave their homes. What happened here was comparable to the great migrations of early days. I cannot describe the terror and suffering of these wretched people. Even tough soldiers cannot bear to see the weeping of women or to hear the wailing of children. The soldiers gave them all the help they could, but many of the women were so terror-stricken that they seemed rooted to the ground. My men harnessed the horses and helped them put their belongings on the carts. When at midday on 19th October, about 2 hours before the entrance of the Russian troops, we left Hodshak in our planes, the village was almost dead. A handful of people who could not bear to leave their homes placed their hopes in the humanity of the Red Army, the mosquito, with an elegant avoiding action before it stung one to death. The mosquitoes not only pursued us in the bomber stream, but as a result of their enormous fuel capacity and flight endurance, also waited for us as we took off from our airfields. They attacked us throughout the whole operation and interfered with our landing. It was almost a daily occurrence that shortly before divisional ops, several mosquitoes would fly over the airfields and shoot down the Mi-S as they took off. In addition to the enemy's air superiority, we now began to have the greatest difficulties in supply. Fuel was stored in great quantities in the depots, but as a result of constant attacks on bridges, roads and railway lines, it no longer reached the airfields. We often pumped the remaining fuel out of several machines to get at least one in the air. This round-the-clock bombing also sowed dissension among our leaders. During the heavy British raids on Pforzheim and Dresden, I received no orders from my wing to take off. On the night of the destruction of Dresden, 13th of February 1945, the enemy bombers droned at low altitude over our heads, but we were in reserve and did not dare to go up. We little lights could not understand this strategy. With the attacks on Pforzheim and Dresden, the Allies' mad dog rage for destruction reached its peak. Just as in antiquity, the city of Pompeii was destroyed by the sudden eruption of Vesuvius. Shortly before the end of the war, the Allies annihilated the cities which had so far been spared, with a burning rain of incendiaries. In particular, the cities of Pforzheim, Dresden and Würzburg. Pforzheim, on 23rd of February 1945, was the first of these Pompeis. The city was laid in ruins and ashes, and about 17,600 people met their deaths in a hurricane of fire and explosions. During the attack, the firefighters were powerless, but even after the raid, the fires could not be put out since the water mains had been damaged and the walls of houses had collapsed and filled the streets. The ash lay 10 feet high in the streets. This storm of fire reached its peak after 10 minutes. It was so powerful that the rain of ash was carried as far as Stuttgart, and the sky turned blood red over a radius of 50 miles. On account of the raging flames and the explosion of delayed action bombs after the attack, the inhabitants dared not leave their cellars and were suffocated. Any who dared to come out collapsed in the white heat of the huge fires. From the fleeing armies and refugees from the east had congregated there. The city was full to capacity. On 13th of February, about 23 Chamsal hours, the bomber formations appeared over the city and enveloped it in a single sea of flames by dropping phosphorus bombs. Hundreds of residents remained stuck in the melting asphalt and were burnt alive like flaming torches. Hundreds, with their clothes on fire, jumped into the icy waters of the Elbe or into the 9-foot-deep water basins from which they could not clamber out. Those who could swim were dragged down into the depths by non-swimmers. The exhibition grounds in the Dresden Gardens were filled with refugees who had taken cover there when the sirens wailed. But even the lawns with their centuries-old trees were sprayed with bombs and phosphorus canisters until a forest fire was raging. The burning city was again subjected at 2 o'clock in the morning to a second carpet of bombs, which transformed the centre of the city into a ruined wilderness. The casualties that night have been estimated at more than 100,000. Most of the bodies could no longer be identified. The human remains were placed on huge steel platforms, sprinkled with petrol and burnt in the open air. In this frenzied assault against the German army and the German cities, Würzburg had been spared, until March 1945, the fury of a modern war. It almost seemed that this would continue, although for some weeks single British bombers had flown over the city. In the early days of March, the Foreign News Service, citing the famous Würzburg Mozart festivals, gave the news, "Achtung, friends of Mozart. On the 16th March we shall play you a Mozart symphony." An appalling nervous tension took hold of the population, which with increasing anxiety followed the daily reports of the bomber formations starting from England. On 16th of March, 2 large formations started from the outskirts of London. One of them flew to the Ruhr and the other over northern Belgium, the Eifel and the Pfalz, towards southern Germany. On this night, which was to prove fatal for the city of Würzburg, I had been in readiness with my wing from 19 hours. We still did not know which German city was to be bombed out within the next few hours. Division merely said that 2 large formations had started from the London area. I got ready with my crew for a tough op. The Naxos apparatus, our talisman against the mosquitoes, was checked once more, for our lives depended upon it. Half an hour later, the fighter directing officer fired a green flare. Orders to take off. Both my engines started well, but then the props stopped. I pressed once more on the starter and revved up. I had injected a highly explosive mixture into the pistons, but the engines would not fire. My fellow pilots were already on the runway. I tried once more, but in vain. The mechanics rushed up. Feldwebel Schopke and Obergefreiter Quandt knew my machine backwards. It could only be some trifling hitch, for these 2 trusty mechanics had kept my machines in perfect order since my first ops in 1941. I had never had any engine trouble. "Come on, Schopke, get in the crate and try your luck," I shouted above the din. At that moment, a young NCO came rushing over from the ops room. "Latest enemy position, Herr Hauptmann. The bomber stream is just short of Ulm. In a few minutes it will be overhead. Probable target Nuremberg." Hell, I thought. I must get in the air, or else I shall be a laggard. Schopke went on trying to get the engine to run. The last warning came from the ops room over the loudspeaker. "Achtung, Achtung! Enemy bombers will be overhead in a few minutes. All lights out. Immediate action stations. Mosquito attacks are to be expected. Careful on taking off." With or without care, I had to get in the air. At last the engine started, and long white flames poured from the exhaust pipes. Schopke pushed the throttle forward, and the machine bucked. No sparking plug failure and no jerks in the engine. I jumped on the wing and slapped my leading mechanic on the shoulder. He helped me to fasten the parachute, and I taxied to the start. Grasshoff called up headquarters, which answered immediately. "Lobster from Thrush 1. I'm taxiing to the flare path. Please light up when I give full throttle. Switch off as soon as I'm airborne." "Victor, Victor," replied Lobster. "Look out for mosquitoes. Good luck." I taxied in the dark and took up my place on the runway. After a brief glance at the instruments and the engines, I gave her full throttle. The flare path lights went on and were switched off as soon as I was airborne. I had hardly levelled out the machine when Marley shouted, "Look out, mosquito!" I thought as much. The Tommies had waited until the fish was on the line, but I did not intend to make things easy for them. I hedge-hopped over the fields and shook off my pursuer. The British were very tough, but they did not propose to indulge in any near-the-ground aerobatics. We all felt rather uncomfortable after this display of stunting. I zoomed and forced the engine to take me up to 12,000 feet. On the tactical waves we heard new enemy reports. Suddenly there was decisive news. "Achtung! Achtung! Bombers are flying in the direction of Nuremberg. A moderate-sized formation reported over Ulm, making for Würzburg. Probable objectives Nuremberg and Würzburg." "They're not even going to respect the hospital city of Würzburg," growled Mahler. "There really aren't any armament factories there." I thought for a moment. Würzburg or Nuremberg? I decided on the former and changed onto a northerly course. The night was reasonably clear apart from a few regulation clouds at 9,000 feet. "We might be able to use them if a mosquito gets on our tail," said Marley. The air seemed empty. In the distance we saw the ribbon of the Main. The moon treacherously lit up the great river. Grasshoff reported contacts on his radar. Then the storm broke. We were approaching the bombers. Before we had got to the enemy, the Master of Ceremonies had dropped his marker flares over the city. Parachute flares drifted slowly down, making the night look ghostly. "Courier 800 yards ahead," reported Grasshoff. At that moment, a slight ticking began in my headphones. Long-range night fighters. Despite this warning, I remained on my course and gave my me full throttle. The ticking grew louder. "Mosquitoes!" shouted Marley. I took avoiding action. The British pilot's tracers went wide below my right wing. The hunt started again. Now we were flying directly over the city among the bomber stream. Then the appalling destruction began. On the orders of the Master of Ceremonies, the 4-engined bomber crews opened their bays and rained incendiaries onto the city below. The phosphorus ignited as soon as it hit the air and joined into a huge burning cloud which slowly settled on the city. It was a dantesque and terrible sight, those unfortunate people who were still in the city. This fiery cloud knew no pity. It sank on churches and houses, palaces and citadels, broad avenues and narrow streets. At the outset, burning drops spurted from the cloud, causing isolated fires. Then the burning veil enveloped Würzburg. In a few moments, a gigantic patch of flame lit up the dark night and turned the clouds to scarlet. Würzburg was burning. By the glow of the doomed city, the bombers found their direction. The small wings and slender bodies gleamed brightly. I could have shot time and time again, but as soon as I was on position, Mahler shouted, "Achtung! Mosquito!" I had instructed him to warn me only in case of great danger. Thus, I dared not reflect when his words rang out. The delay of a second, and we should fall like a blazing torch out of the sky. Then a 4-engined Lancaster crossed my path. Without a thought, I poured a long burst into its fuselage and wings. The crate exploded in the air and spun down with its crew. That was my only kill over Würzburg, and incidentally my last kill of the war. It attracted the entire enemy night fighter pack on my heels. We could hardly watch the bomber crash on the ground before they set upon us. The Naxos apparatus lit up constantly. Mahler no longer shouted, "Achtung!" but sat and fired his tracers at the mosquitoes. No avoiding action, no banking, no hide-and-seek in the clouds was of any avail. The British pilot remained on my tail. Fortunately, he always began from long range and his aim was inaccurate, and then suddenly Marley shouted in terror, "Mosquito close behind us!" His voice made me shudder. Even as I banked, the burst hit my machine. There was a reek of smoke and fire, terrifying seconds ahead, but I let my machine dive to be rid of my pursuer. The altimeter fell rapidly, 2500, 2000, 1500, 1000. Now I had to pull out unless I wanted to go straight into the ground. I pulled with all my might on the joystick and got the diving machine under control. Luckily, the controls answered. There was still an acrid smell of smoke in the cabin. Perhaps a cable was smouldering, but the engines were running smoothly. We hedge-hopped over Swabia towards our airfield Leipheim. Mahler lit up the cockpit with his torch. Everything was in order. Then he focused it on the engine. There was a white trickle on the starboard wing. Petrol. One of the pipes had been shot through and the fuel was leaking out. The needle on the fuel indicator slowly sank to empty. This was a fatal situation, but misfortunes never come singly. Mahler reported reactions in the Naxos, and the sinister tick-ticking started again in the headphones. The British never give up. This one pursued us even to our airfield. We had to land, and avoiding action was impossible. It was pointless coming down anywhere except in Leipheim. Grasshoff called the airfield, which replied faintly. A few terrifying minutes. I pumped the petrol from the port into the starboard tank with the electric pump. Would we have enough? If the right engine conked, it would be the end. I now spoke to the ground station myself. Everything depended upon a skillful landing, or else the Mosquito would shoot me down as I approached the runway. Lobster from Thrush 1. Come in, please. Thrush 1 from Lobster. Victor, Victor. Loud and clear. Take care. Night fighters circling the airfield. That was to have been expected. The Britisher did not want to miss me. I replied, Victor, Victor. I must land. Little fuel left. Don't light up. I'll land blind. Put a white lamp on the landing cross and one red lamp at the end of the flare path. Don't switch on. The ground station had understood my plan to fool the Mosquito. Marler sat at his guns in the rear cockpit. I lowered the wing flaps to 20 degrees and circled at low speed over the airfield. The British were searching. The ticking in my headphones was continuous, but the fellows did not dare to come down. I was more than 100 feet above the ground. Tensely, I watched the proceedings on the runway. At any moment, the 2 ground lights would go on. The perspiration was pouring from my forehead. I only hoped that 2 lights would be sufficient to bring my machine down in safety. I must rely entirely upon my instruments, for the 2 petrol lamps would give me neither my height nor the direction of the machine. Should I not let them turn on the lights just as I landed? But this seemed too risky. The mosquitoes were looking with Argus eyes at this field, and if it lit up, they would immediately see the machines parked and the sheds. During these reflections, I gained height. The red control lamps of the petrol tanks lit up. That meant fuel for no more than 5 minutes. I must land. I had turned my radio to the ground station in order to give the Tommies no hint. But now I was in great danger. I pressed the button. Lobster from Thrush 1. Hurry, please, hurry, please. Fuel for another 5 minutes. Oberfeldwebel Kramer replied at once. Thrush 1 from Lobster. Lamps in position. You can land. We looked for them, and Marler was the first to discover them. They gave a very faint light. Directly above the white lamp, I started the stopwatch and set my machine on its course. The white light disappeared behind the tail unit. If I flew correctly as I came in over the field, it would bob up ahead of me. Marler suddenly shouted, There's one ahead to starboard, a bit higher. I only caught a glimpse of exhaust pipes disappearing in the darkness. For God's sake, don't shout so loud, Marley, I replied. The seconds passed. If only my fuel would last out. A short pressure on the hydraulic gear. Undercarriage lowered. At any moment now the white lamp would appear in the darkness. My eyes peered into the night. There it was. Throttle back. Float. The wheels touched down. I put on the brakes and the machine gradually came to a standstill. We'd made it. Grasshoff opened the cockpit roof. Herr Hauptmann, the Tommies are droning right overhead. Something's up. I cautiously gave a little throttle to prevent the flames darting from the engine. Any reflection would betray us. In the darkness we taxied to our dispersal pen. Then the accident happened. An over-eager mechanic trying to be helpful flashed his green torch. The mosquitoes were on the watch. I turned the machine into wind and cut off the engine. Marley shouted, Put that torch out, you bloody fool. At that moment we heard an increasingly loud whistle in the air. The Tommy was diving on the airfield. Quick, get out of the machine. It's going to get hot here. Too late. The British pilot shot and the tracers made directly for us. Instinctively I ducked and there was a sinister rattle in the machine. I sprang out of my seat onto the left wing and fell over Grasshoff and Marler as I slipped to the ground. A Feldwebel was writhing on the ground. Then the second mosquito made its attack. The burning machine made an easy target. With a few leaps we got clear of the machine and lay flat on the ground. Grasshoff and Marler were close behind me. The second burst was a winner. Our good me. 110 exploded and went up in flames. Now the British were in their element. Powerless, we had to watch 2 more night fighters go up in flames. Our wretched flak began to fire, but with no success. Or did they? The Tommies suddenly flew off to the west. Only then did we come to our senses. The fire engine came up and put out the fires. Near my completely burnt-out machine were 2 soldiers. One of them, An NCO from the fighter control staff was dead and the other badly wounded. By a miracle we were unhurt, apart from a few scratches. My driver, Vacha, fetched me and said, "Herr Hauptmann, once more you've got away with it." Kramer, the fighter controller, flung his arms round my neck. "I have never sweated so much in my life," he said. "The Tommies are getting more and more impertinent." Feeling quite exhausted, I got on the line to division and gave my report. Raid on Würzburg, British dropping phosphorus canisters. The city is on fire. Strong fighter defence. A 4-engined Lancaster shot down. Further details not observed. Machine shot up on landing by Mosquito. 1 dead, 1 wounded. 2 further machines destroyed. 1st April 1945. The last flash before the end. The Allies were fighting in the heart of Germany. Everything was collapsing, but Goebbels still prophesied final victory. Werewolves operated in the rear of the enemy. The Führer defended the capital. This period just before final defeat was a great strain on my nerves. It was a most difficult time for the responsible CO of a night fighter wing. What could I say to my troops? How could I keep up their spirits? Was further sacrifice any use? The men understood me. We went the same way together to the bitter end in our comradeship. There was no more night fighting. My pilots flew night after night, independently attacking tanks and columns of trucks. Many did not return. The Americans pressed on to Ulm. We retreated to München-Neubiberg, where we joined up with the other remnants of the Luftwaffe, day fighters, night fighters, bombers, recce planes and Stukas. Mysterious machines landed and took off again. Even General Galland appeared. He had fallen into disgrace with the Führer, but was very popular with us. In his jet fighter he attacked the bomber stream and shot down several flying fortresses. A little lull for me. I sent a heavy truck to Ingolstadt to pick up a load of splinter bombs for our attacks on enemy columns. The munitions dump blew up shortly before the arrival of the truck. The driver came across a fully stocked supply dump and brought back 100 crates of brandy and tinned food. 20th April 1945. On the Führer's birthday, each soldier was issued with 3 bottles of brandy, 3 tins of food and cigarettes. Spirits rose. Major Fritz, an old reservist, reported that my wing was present in full complement. What should I say to them? I gave a flashback to the successes of our No. 3 Night Fighter Wing No. 6 and ended with the words, "Comrades, a difficult path lies ahead, a path into an obscure future. We must take this road with a brave heart and in the conviction that one day the sun will shine once more. Preserve the spirit of comradeship in your hearts. Think of our fallen comrades and do not forget the reason they lost their lives. For our fatherland, for Germany." A few days later, my CO from Venlo days, Oberleutnant Streib, came into the mess. My thoughts returned to the old No. I Night Fighter Wing No. 1, to my dead comrades Frank, Nacker, Lent, Mührer, Strinning, Wandam, Forster, Herzog, Schmitz, and many others. We swapped memories and thought of the great days of night fighting over Holland. They were in the past. That day, heavy shadows lay over our country, and the storm clouds had darkened the sun. In the evening we said goodbye and wished each other good luck. On 28th April 1945, the last command came from division. We retired to Bad Aibling. The American tanks were at the gates of Munich. On the night of 30th April, my No. 3 Night Fighter Wing No. 6 was given their last operation. Shortly after midnight, with a heavy heart, I gave orders for them to blow up the remaining machines. Fate has dispersed my friends in all directions. But 3 things we have all preserved in our hearts: fidelity to flying, wartime comradeship, and the proud memory of our night fighting days.